600 years, 3 continents, 500 million people under one ruler. And it all started with a man nobody took seriously in a territory so small it didn't even appear on most maps. When a new sultan came to power, his first official act was to have all of his brothers killed. Not imprisoned, not exiled, killed. Every single one. It was not a scandal. It was not a crime. It was the law, written into the legal code of the most powerful empire in the world. The reasoning was simple. A living brother is a future rival, and rivals are how empires fall apart, so you eliminate the problem before it becomes one. Welcome to the Ottoman Empire. For 600 years, this empire ruled over 3 continents. At its peak, it controlled the entire eastern Mediterranean, most of North Africa, all of the Middle East, and deep into Eastern Europe. 32 countries that exist on a map today were once a single Ottoman territory. It produced some of the most capable rulers in history and some of the most spectacularly insane ones. It built the most feared military machine in the medieval world using soldiers who had been taken from their families as children, converted to a new religion, trained from birth to fight and die for a sultan they would never truly know. And when those soldiers eventually turned on their own emperors, which they did repeatedly, the results were absolutely extraordinary. This is not the story of a simple conquest empire. This is 600 years of politics and betrayal and military genius and palace intrigue and slow, inevitable decline that reads like the longest and most dramatic television series ever written, except every single thing in it actually happened. We are going to cover all of it today. But before we start, subscribe and hit the bell, because the Ottoman sultans had a list of people they considered a problem, and historically, not subscribing has always been a terrible life decision. Let's go. In the year 1299, in a small corner of northwestern Anatolia that most people in the powerful courts of the medieval world would have struggled to find on a map, a man named Osman declared independence. This was not a dramatic moment. There were no trumpets, no grand ceremony, no foreign dignitaries present. Osman was the leader of a small Turkic tribal group that had been given a modest piece of territory on the frontier between the collapsing Seljuk Sultanate and the shrinking Byzantine Empire. His people were semi-nomadic, his army was small, his treasury was essentially whatever his soldiers could carry. By every measurable standard of the day, the Osmanli, the people of Osman, the word that would eventually become Ottoman, were completely unremarkable. There were dozens of similar small Turkic principalities scattered across Anatolia at this period, all of them jostling for territory and influence in the vacuum left by the Mongol destruction of the Seljuk state. None of them looked particularly threatening. None of them looked like the seed of a 600-year empire. And yet, there was something different about Osman and the people around him, something that historians have been arguing about for centuries and that probably cannot be reduced to a single explanation. Part of it was geography. Osman's territory sat right on the Byzantine frontier. This meant 2 things simultaneously: constant conflict that kept his warriors sharp and battle-hardened, and constant opportunity for expansion into Byzantine territory that was increasingly poorly defended. The Byzantine Empire in 1299 was a shadow of what it had been. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1904 had never been fully recovered from. The economy was damaged, the military was understaffed, the frontier garrisons were stretched thin and often unpaid. Byzantine villages along the frontier were vulnerable in ways they had not been for centuries. Osman and his warriors raided these villages. They recruited from the local population. They offered relatively generous terms to settlements that submitted. Keep your property, keep your religion, pay your taxes, and we will protect you. This was not typical of frontier raiding parties of the period. Most raiders took what they could and moved on. Osman was thinking about something more permanent. He was thinking about governance. He was thinking about building something rather than just taking something. This distinction between a raider and a ruler is what separated the Ottoman Emirate from its neighbors from almost the very beginning. Osman understood that a territory you govern is worth infinitely more than a territory you merely plunder. A plundered village produces wealth once. A governed village produces wealth every year for as long as you hold it. And if the people in that village feel safe and fairly treated, they will not revolt the moment a rival appears. This administrative instinct, combined with the military pressure of constant frontier warfare, began to attract people. Warriors looking for opportunity, religious scholars looking for patronage, administrators looking for a functional state to work in. The Ottoman Emirate was small, but it was organized, and in the chaos of 14th century Anatolia, organized was enormously valuable. Osman died around 1323 probably, though the exact date is uncertain. Early Ottoman history is frustratingly poorly documented, partly because the Ottomans themselves didn't develop a strong tradition of written historical record until later in their imperial history. What we know is that he left his son Orhan a state that was already expanding and a momentum that would prove impossible to stop. Orhan was a different kind of ruler from his father, more focused on administration, more interested in building institutions than personally leading raids. Under Orhan, the Ottoman state began to look like a genuine government rather than an extended military camp. He created a regular army, separate from the tribal warrior bands that had formed the core of Osman's force. He established a rudimentary bureaucracy. He began minting coins, a crucial signal that you intend to stay somewhere permanently, because you don't mint coins for territory you plan to abandon. The first great prize came in 1326 when Orhan's forces took Bursa, the first major Byzantine city to fall to the Ottomans. Bursa became the Ottoman capital, a real city with real infrastructure, which immediately transformed the emirate from a frontier raiding operation into something that genuinely resembled a state. From Bursa, Orhan continued pressing west and northwest. Nicaea fell in 1331. Nicomedia fell in 1337. These were not small frontier villages. These were major Byzantine cities with long histories and significant populations. Each one that fell made the Ottoman state larger, richer, and more credible in the eyes of the other powers of the region. Then came the crossing that changed everything. In 1352, a small Ottoman force crossed the Dardanelles into Europe for the first time. It was not a full invasion. It was a military assistance mission helping a Byzantine faction in a civil war of all things. But it established that the Ottomans could operate in Europe, and it established that European territory was available. By 1354, Ottoman forces had established permanent footholds on the European side of the strait. By 1369, they had taken Adrianople, the second city of the Byzantine Empire, the most important city in Thrace, and made it their new capital. Think about that for a moment. An empire that had started as a tiny frontier emirate in northwestern Anatolia had within 70 years of its founding moved its capital to Europe. Constantinople was now surrounded. The Byzantine Empire was now an island of Christian territory in a sea of Ottoman expansion, and the Ottomans had barely gotten started. The foundation had been laid. The institutions were in place, the military machine was developing, and there were men coming who would take all of this foundation and build something the world had never seen before. At some point in the mid-14th century, the Ottoman state introduced one of the most extraordinary and disturbing military innovations in all of history. It was called the Devshirme. The word means collection, and what was collected on a regular basis from the Christian populations of the Balkans and Anatolia was boys. Not volunteers, not criminals, not prisoners of war. Boys. Healthy, intelligent boys between roughly 8 and 20 years old, selected by Ottoman officials who traveled through Christian villages with specific criteria in mind. The strongest, the smartest, the most promising. Taken from their families, taken from their villages, taken from their religion, converted to Islam, and trained from that moment forward to be the most loyal and most effective soldiers in the Ottoman military. These boys became the Janissaries. The word comes from the Turkish Yeniçeri, new soldiers, and they were genuinely new in a way that had no precedent. In almost every other military system in history, soldiers had loyalties that existed before and outside their military service. They had families who might exert pressure on their decisions. They had regional identities that might conflict with central authority. They had property that they cared about protecting. The Janissaries had none of this. They were taken so young that their pre-Ottoman identity was largely erased. They were given a new name, a new religion, a new language, a new community. Their entire world was the Ottoman military. Their brothers were their fellow Janissaries. Their father figure was the sultan. And because they owed everything, literally everything, their survival, their identity, their status, their very existence to the Ottoman state, their loyalty was theoretically absolute. This was the theory. The practice was, as we will see, considerably more complicated. But as a military concept, it was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. The Devshirme created a professional standing army at a time when most rulers in the world were still relying on feudal levies of varying quality and questionable reliability. The Janissaries were trained continuously, not just when a campaign was being planned. They were paid regularly, not just when they fought. They were organized, disciplined, and equipped to a standard that most armies of the period could not match. The training process was extraordinarily thorough. A boy taken through the Devshirme would spend years in a palace school before he ever saw a battlefield. He would be educated, not just in military skills, but in languages, administration, Islamic theology, music, mathematics. The Ottoman state understood that the best soldiers were not just physically capable, but intellectually developed. A janissary who could read, calculate, and speak multiple languages was more useful than one who could only swing a sword. The palace schools that trained the janissaries also trained the future administrators of the empire. The boys who showed exceptional administrative ability were not sent to the military, they were sent into the bureaucracy. Boys taken from their families in Christian villages in Greece or Bulgaria or Serbia might end up as provincial governors, treasury officials, or grand viziers running the entire imperial government. This created something genuinely unprecedented, an administrative class that owed its position entirely to the sultan's favor rather than to hereditary aristocracy. In most empires of the period, the great administrative positions were filled by men from noble families who had their own power bases, their own networks, their own interests that frequently diverged from the rulers. The Ottoman bureaucracy was staffed by men who had no independent power base at all, men who had been nobody before the Ottoman system elevated them, men who knew that everything they had could be taken away the moment the sultan decided to take it. This created an administration of extraordinary efficiency and extraordinary danger simultaneously. Efficient because every man in it was motivated to perform. The rewards for competence were enormous, and the penalties for failure were absolute. Dangerous because it also meant that the entire system depended on the quality of the sultan at its center. A strong, capable sultan with good judgment could direct this machine with terrifying precision. A weak, paranoid, or incompetent sultan could destroy it just as efficiently. The Janissaries themselves became, over time, one of the most politically powerful forces in the empire. The men who had been taken as children to serve the sultan eventually realized their own collective strength. An army that can make sultans can also unmake them. And they did, repeatedly, with consequences that we will get to when we reach the long decline. But in the early centuries of the empire, the Janissaries were exactly what their creators intended, the most professional, most disciplined, most feared military force in the known world. Mehmed II came to the throne for the second time in 1451. I say second time because he had briefly been sultan as a child before being pushed aside by his father, who came out of retirement to resume power, which tells you something about the instability of even the most powerful dynasties. He was 21 years old. He was extraordinarily intelligent, spoke 6 languages, was deeply interested in philosophy and science, had been reading about Constantinople and its walls and its history since he was a child. He was also ruthless in a way that went beyond the ordinary political ruthlessness of his era. When he took the throne, he had his infant brother drowned in his bath. When the ambassador protested, Mehmed had him executed too. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a statement of intent. Mehmed was going to rule exactly as he wished, and anyone who thought they could constrain or moderate him was going to find out very quickly how wrong they were. He had been thinking about Constantinople for years. The great city on the Bosporus, the last remnant of the Byzantine Empire, had been a problem and an opportunity for every Ottoman sultan before him. It sat in the middle of Ottoman territory, technically an independent state, practically an enclave. Its control of the Bosporus meant it could theoretically disrupt Ottoman communications between Europe and Asia. Its symbolic importance as the capital of what had been the Roman Empire, as the seat of Orthodox Christianity, made it a prize beyond ordinary military calculation. Mehmed began planning the conquest immediately. He was systematic and thorough in a way that distinguished him from commanders who relied primarily on force. He commissioned the great cannon from the Hungarian engineer Urban. He built a fortress, Rumeli Hisari, on the European shore of the Bosporus just north of Constantinople in 1452, completing it in an astonishing 4 months. This fortress, combined with an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian shore, gave him complete control of the Bosporus Strait. Constantinople was now cut off from Black Sea resupply without Ottoman permission. He gathered intelligence about the walls, their thickness, their weak points, the position of the gates, the size of the garrison. He studied previous attempts to take the city and understood precisely why they had failed. He was not going to make the same mistakes. The siege began on April 6, 1453. We have covered the Byzantine side of this story already. From the Ottoman perspective, it was a demonstration of systematic military planning executed with remarkable precision. The great cannon fired against the walls. Byzantine defenders repaired the breaches at night. Ottoman forces probed for weaknesses along the entire 14-mile perimeter. The naval operation to drag ships overland into the Golden Horn, one of the most audacious logistics operations of the medieval period, outflanked the Byzantine chain boom that had protected the harbor. The final assault on May 29th succeeded because of a combination of sustained attrition, superior numbers, and the single critical failure of the Byzantine defense at the Kirko Porta Gate. When Mehmed II rode into Constantinople that morning, he was 21 years old. He had just accomplished something that had defeated every army that had attempted it for over 1,000 years. He rode directly to the Hagia Sophia, dismounted, poured earth over his head in a gesture of humility before God, and entered. He converted it to a mosque that same day. But what Mehmed did next is what truly reveals his character and his vision. He did not sack the city in the conventional sense. He stopped the looting after the first day. He issued orders protecting the remaining population. He invited Greek scholars and craftsmen to remain. He appointed a new Greek Orthodox patriarch, understanding that the church was a tool of governance that he could use to manage the Christian population of his empire. He declared himself Kaiser-i Rum, Caesar of Rome. He was not just a conqueror, he was a successor. He intended to rule not as an invader who had destroyed something, but as the heir to everything Constantinople represented. The city was renamed Istanbul, though the Ottomans themselves continued to use Constantinople in official documents for decades. The greatest city in Christendom became the greatest city in the Islamic world. And Mehmed II, the 21-year-old who had spent his childhood dreaming of those walls, spent the rest of his reign building something worthy of them. He launched campaigns in every direction, into the Balkans, into Anatolia, into the Black Sea region, even landing forces in Italy. When he died in 1481 at the age of 49, Constantinople had been the Ottoman capital for nearly 30 years. The empire stretched across 2 continents. And what was coming next would make even Mehmed's achievements look modest. One of the most interesting things about Mehmed II is that he understood Constantinople not just as a military prize, but as a project. Taking the city was the beginning, not the end. The city he found in 1453 was a shadow of what it had been. Centuries of Byzantine decline, the catastrophic Latin sack of 1204, the economic damage of the Ottoman encirclement, all of these had reduced a city that had once held 500,000 people to something closer to 50,000. Its great buildings crumbling, its streets increasingly empty, its commercial life a fraction of what it had been under the Byzantine Golden Age. Mehmed intended to change this, immediately and comprehensively. He began repopulating the city with a combination of deliberate policy and direct compulsion. He relocated entire communities, Greeks from the Aegean Islands, Armenians from Anatolia, Jews expelled from various European cities, Turks from the Anatolian heartland, into Constantinople. He understood something that rulers before him and after him often forgot, that a great city requires a diverse, commercially active population. A city of warriors alone produces nothing except military capacity. A city of merchants and craftsmen and scholars produces wealth, culture, and stability. The Jewish communities that Mehmed invited into Constantinople were particularly significant. Jews had been facing increasing persecution across Western Europe. They would be expelled from Spain in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, in one of history's great coincidences of timing. The Ottoman Empire under Mehmed and his successors became one of the few places in the world where Jewish communities could live and work in relative safety. The practical benefit to the Ottomans was enormous. Jewish merchants had trade networks across Europe that the Ottomans could now access. The cultural benefit was even larger. Mehmed commissioned new buildings across the city. The Topkapi Palace, begun in 1459, became the nerve center of the empire, a vast complex of administrative buildings, residential quarters, libraries, and gardens that would grow and expand over the next 4 centuries into one of the most extraordinary royal residences in history. The Grand Bazaar was established, creating the commercial heart of the new imperial capital. New mosques were built alongside existing churches that were converted to Islamic worship. Beyond the physical rebuilding of the city, Mehmed was engaged in an intellectual project that was genuinely extraordinary for a military conqueror of his era. He was deeply interested in ideas. He collected manuscripts. He invited scholars, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, to his court and engaged them in debate. He reportedly sat for a portrait by the Venetian artist Gentile Bellini, which scandalized some of his more conservative advisors and delighted everyone who understood that a sultan willing to be painted by a Christian artist from Venice was a sultan with an unusually sophisticated understanding of the world. He was interested in geography, commissioning maps of the known world that synthesized Islamic and European cartographic knowledge. He was interested in philosophy, engaging with the ideas of Plato and Aristotle through the Greek scholars who remained in Constantinople after the conquest. He styled himself not just as an Islamic sultan, but as a universal emperor, the heir to both the Roman imperial tradition and the Islamic caliphal tradition. This dual identity was not cynical political theater. Mehmed genuinely believed that he was building something that transcended any single cultural tradition, an empire that could contain Greeks and Turks and Armenians and Jews and Slavs and Arabs, governing each community according to its own laws and traditions, while maintaining a single overarching imperial authority. The system he developed for managing this diversity was called the millet system. Different religious communities, Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, Jews, were allowed to govern their own internal affairs according to their own religious law. They paid their taxes to the Ottoman state. They obeyed Ottoman civil and military authority, but in matters of personal status, marriage, divorce, inheritance, religious practice, they were governed by their own community institutions. It was not equality in the modern sense. Non-Muslims paid additional taxes and faced certain legal disadvantages, but compared to the treatment of religious minorities in most of the contemporary Christian world, it was remarkably tolerant. When Mehmed died in 1481, he left an empire of extraordinary potential. What it needed was a ruler who could take that potential and push it to its absolute maximum. Suleiman came to the throne in 1520 and immediately demonstrated that he was operating on a different level from almost every ruler of his era. He was 26 years old, educated at the palace school that had been producing Ottoman administrators and soldiers for generations, and possessed of a combination of military ability, administrative talent, and cultural sophistication that made him almost uniquely suited to the moment in which he ruled. The Western world called him Suleiman the Magnificent. His own people called him Kanuni, the lawgiver. Both names are accurate, both names are also insufficient. In the decade between 1520 and 1530, Suleiman launched military campaigns that reshaped the map of the known world. He took Belgrade in 1521, removing the main fortress that had protected Hungary from Ottoman expansion. He took Rhodes in 1522, expelling the Knights Hospitalier who had been raiding Ottoman shipping from that island for decades. He crushed the Kingdom of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, killing the Hungarian king and effectively ending Hungary as an independent state. He besieged Vienna in 1529, and this is one of history's great near misses, because if Vienna had fallen, the Ottoman Empire would have had a direct path into the heart of Western Europe. It didn't fall, primarily because of supply line problems and the onset of autumn, but the fact that Ottoman armies were besieging the capital of the Habsburgs sent a shockwave through Christian Europe that lasted for generations. Simultaneously, Suleiman was fighting in the east. He pushed into Persia, taking Tabriz and Baghdad, and extending Ottoman control over Mesopotamia. He was fighting a two-front war across thousands of miles simultaneously. West against the Habsburgs and their allies, east against the Safavid Persian Empire, and he was winning on both fronts. His navy, under the command of the extraordinary admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, dominated the Mediterranean. Ottoman fleets raided the coasts of Italy and Spain. The island of Jerba became an Ottoman base in the western Mediterranean. At Suleiman's peak, the Ottoman Empire stretched from Hungary in the northwest to Yemen in the southeast, from Algeria in the west to the borders of Persia in the east. But Suleiman was far more than a conqueror. The lawgiver title was earned through one of the most significant legal reforms in Ottoman history, a comprehensive reorganization of the imperial legal code that rationalized the relationship between Ottoman secular law and Islamic religious law, established consistent legal standards across the empire's enormous and diverse territory, and created an administrative framework that would govern the empire for centuries after his death. His reign was also the high point of Ottoman cultural achievement. The architect Mimar Sinan, working under Suleiman's patronage, produced some of the greatest buildings in the history of Islamic architecture. The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1558, is one of the finest buildings of the 16th century anywhere in the world. Sinan went on to build hundreds of structures across the empire: mosques, bridges, schools, hospitals, caravansaries, in a building program that rivaled the greatest architectural patronage of the Renaissance popes or the Byzantine emperors. Ottoman poetry, miniature painting, textile production, and ceramics all reached their peak during Suleiman's reign. The empire at this moment was not just a military power, it was one of the great centers of human civilization, producing art and architecture and literature that still commands admiration today. There is also the story of Harem Sultan, the woman known in the West as Roxolana, which tells you something essential about how power actually operated at the Ottoman court. Harem was a slave woman, probably from what is now Ukraine, who entered the imperial harem as a concubine and through intelligence, charm, and extraordinary political skill became not just Suleiman's favorite, but his legal wife, something almost without precedent in Ottoman history. She bore him multiple sons. She managed the harem, which was the most politically dangerous environment in the empire, with absolute mastery. She corresponded with foreign rulers, she commissioned charitable foundations. She was, in every sense that mattered, a co-ruler. And when she died in 1558, 4 years before Suleiman himself, he reportedly never recovered from the loss. The great conqueror, who had campaigned across 2 continents for 46 years, was broken by the death of a woman who had started life as a slave. Suleiman died in 71 and had been sultan for 46 years. The empire he left behind was the most powerful state in the world. Let's talk about the harem, because almost everything the Western world believes about the Ottoman harem is wrong in ways that are both fascinating and revealing. The Western imagination, shaped by centuries of Orientalist fantasy, romantic novels, and early Hollywood films, pictures the harem as a vast pleasure palace filled with passive, compliant women whose entire existence revolved around the desires of the sultan. The reality was so different that it barely resembles this image at all. The word harem comes from the Arabic haram, forbidden, sacred, protected. It referred to the private quarters of the palace, the space reserved for the imperial family and their household. It was not primarily a place of pleasure, it was the domestic and administrative heart of the imperial household, a compound that at its peak housed hundreds of women and their staff, organized according to a strict hierarchy, governed by its own internal rules and power structures, and connected to the imperial government in ways that made it one of the most politically significant spaces in the entire empire. The women of the harem were not passive. They were, for the most part, extraordinarily well-educated. They spoke multiple languages. They were trained in music, poetry, calligraphy, and the complex protocols of Ottoman court life. The senior women of the harem, particularly the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, exercised enormous political power. The Valide Sultan was arguably the second most powerful person in the empire during periods when her son was young or weak. She managed the internal politics, controlled access to the Sultan, received foreign ambassadors, and corresponded with rulers across the known world. The period of Ottoman history between roughly 1550 and 1660 is actually called the Sultanate of Women by historians, a 100-year period during which the real political power of the empire frequently resided in the harem rather than in the council chambers. This was not a secret that was carefully concealed from contemporaries. Foreign ambassadors knew it, Ottoman officials knew it, the Grand Viziers who technically ran the government knew it. The women of the harem, operating through their sons and their networks and their direct access to the Sultan, were often more politically effective than the men nominally in charge. The internal politics of the harem were extraordinarily complex and frequently lethal. The basic dynamic was this: the Sultan's concubines competed to bear sons because bearing a son was the only path to real power. A concubine who bore a son became a haseki, a privileged consort, with her own apartments, her own staff, her own income. If her son became sultan, she became Valide Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. If her son didn't become sultan, if another woman's son reached the throne first, the consequences ranged from comfortable retirement to execution, depending on how politically threatening the new sultan considered his father's other children to be. The practice of fratricide, the killing of rival princes when a new sultan came to power, which we mentioned in the hook, was directly connected to harem politics. Every concubine who bore a son was simultaneously raising a potential sultan and a potential target. The system created extraordinary incentives for manipulation, alliance building, and, when necessary, murder. Poisonings were not uncommon. Political alliances between concubines and senior officials were standard practice. The woman who could navigate this environment successfully, who could protect her son, build her network, manage her relationships with the Janissary leadership and the religious establishment and the Grand Vizier simultaneously, was a political operator of the highest order. Harem Sultan, who we mentioned in the Suleiman section, was the greatest of these operators, but she was not unique. Kosem Sultan, who served as regent for two child sultans in the 17th century, was arguably even more powerful. She effectively ran the Ottoman Empire for nearly 2 decades. She was eventually strangled by servants loyal to her daughter-in-law in a palace coup that reads like something from a political thriller, except that it happened in real life in 1651. The Ottoman harem was not a place of passive femininity. It was a crucible of political competition as intense and as dangerous as anything happening in the council chambers or on the battlefield. The women who thrived in it were among the most capable political minds the empire produced. They just didn't get chapters in the history books until relatively recently. To understand why the Ottoman Empire was able to expand so dramatically and maintain such a vast territory for so long, you have to understand what made its military different from the armies it was fighting. In the 15th and 16th centuries, most European armies were feudal or semi-feudal, collections of noble contingents with varying levels of training, equipment, and reliability, assembled for specific campaigns and then disbanded. They fought when it was convenient. They went home when it wasn't. Their loyalty was to their lord or their king, but that loyalty had limits that were well understood by both parties. The Ottoman military was built on completely different principles. At its core was the Janissary infantry, professional, continuously trained, regularly paid, organized, and disciplined in ways that European armies of the period could not match. Around the Janissary corps were the Sipahi, cavalry soldiers who held land grants from the Sultan in exchange for military service, giving them a direct economic stake in the empire's success and expansion. Around the Sipahi were the irregular forces, Akinji raiders who preceded the main army, disrupting enemy territory and gathering intelligence, and various provincial forces that could be mobilized for major campaigns. The logistics system that supported this army was genuinely extraordinary. The Ottoman army understood that an army that cannot feed itself cannot fight, and they organized their supply chains with a precision that contemporary European armies rarely matched. When the Ottoman army moved, it moved with bakeries, hospitals, armories, and administrative offices. It was essentially a moving city capable of sustaining itself in the field for extended periods. The army's adoption of gunpowder weapons was also earlier and more systematic than most of their opponents. The great cannon that breached the walls of Constantinople in 1453 was not an anomaly. It represented a genuine Ottoman commitment to artillery that continued and deepened over the following century. By the time of Suleiman, the Ottoman artillery train was the most sophisticated in the world, capable of reducing virtually any fixed fortification given sufficient ammunition. The Ottoman Navy deserves special attention because it is often overlooked in popular accounts that focus on the land campaigns. Under Suleiman and his successor Selim II, the Ottoman Navy became the dominant force in the Mediterranean, a transformation that was largely the work of one extraordinary man, Hydratian Barbarossa, born on the Greek island of Lesbos, who began his career as a corsair raiding Christian shipping and ended it as the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet. Barbarossa was one of the most capable naval commanders of the 16th century. He defeated the combined fleet of the Holy Roman Empire, Venice, Genoa, and the Papal States at the Battle of Preveza in 1538, establishing Ottoman naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean that would last for decades. He raided the coasts of Spain and Italy, taking thousands of captives and delivering enormous quantities of loot to Istanbul. He occupied the island of Jerba off the North African coast, extending Ottoman influence deep into the western Mediterranean. The North African territories, Algeria, Tunisia, and eventually Libya, came under Ottoman suzerainty largely through the activities of naval commanders like Barbarossa, creating a crescent of Ottoman influence around the southern Mediterranean that made the empire a maritime as well as a land power. At its maximum extent, the Ottoman Empire was fighting simultaneous wars on 4 separate fronts: against the Habsburgs in Central Europe, against the Safavid Persians in the East, against the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, and maintaining naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. The logistical and administrative achievement of sustaining all of this simultaneously across a territory spanning 3 continents is genuinely staggering. The system worked because of the quality of the central administration, the Sublime Porte as the Ottoman government became known, and because of the Devshirme-trained bureaucracy that staffed it. Men who owed everything to the Sultan, who had no independent power base, who were motivated by merit rather than by birth. This was the engine that made the machine run. For as long as the sultans were capable and the system functioned as designed, the Ottoman Empire was essentially unstoppable. The problems began when the sultans stopped being capable, and that happened sooner than anyone would have liked. The conventional date given for the beginning of Ottoman decline is 1571, the Battle of Lepanto, where a combined Christian fleet under Don John of Austria destroyed the Ottoman navy in the Gulf of Patras. It was the first major Ottoman military defeat in over a century, and it sent shockwaves across the Christian world. Church bells rang in Rome. Poets wrote about it. It was hailed as the salvation of Western civilization, and then, almost immediately, it became largely irrelevant. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within a year. They lost Cyprus to the Crusader alliance that had supposedly defeated them. They continued expanding in North Africa. Within 5 years of Lepanto, the Ottoman navy was operating in the Mediterranean at essentially the same level as before. Lepanto matters historically, but not militarily. It proved that the Ottomans could be defeated, which was psychologically enormous, but it did not actually change the strategic situation in any meaningful way. The real beginning of Ottoman decline has nothing to do with foreign enemies and everything to do with internal politics. It begins with the Janissaries. The men who had been designed as the instrument of imperial power gradually became the constraint on it. Over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, the Janissaries evolved from an elite professional military corps into something closer to a hereditary interest group. The original Devshirme system had been designed to produce soldiers with no family ties and no independent interests. By the late 16th century, Janissaries were marrying, having children, and arranging for their sons to be enrolled in the corps without going through the Devshirme. They were accumulating property. They were developing political interests of their own that frequently diverged from the interests of the Sultan. They had also discovered that they were the most powerful military force in the empire, and that sultans who displeased them could be removed. Between 1617 and 1648, the Janissaries deposed 4 sultans. This is not a small statistic. 4 sultans, Four of the most powerful rulers in the world were removed from power by their own soldiers in a 30-year period. The message this sent to every subsequent sultan was clear: govern in a way that the Janissaries approve of, or face the consequences. The political consequences of Janissary power were devastating for the empire's governance. Sultans who feared their own soldiers could not pursue military reforms that threatened Janissary privileges. When European armies were modernizing in the 17th and 18th centuries, adopting new tactics, new weapons, new organizational structures, the Ottomans were largely frozen in place because any attempt to reform the military was resisted by the Janissaries as a threat to their position. The empire that had been a military innovator in the 15th and 16th centuries became a military conservative in the 17th and 18th, unable to adapt because adaptation threatened the power of the men with the most swords. The problem was compounded by the deteriorating quality of the sultans themselves. The Ottoman system of succession, which had always been brutal but had generally produced competent rulers because competition between princes was fierce, changed in the early 17th century in a way that had terrible unintended consequences. The practice of fratricide was replaced by a system called the kafez, the cage. Rather than killing his brothers when he took the throne, a new sultan would imprison them in a comfortable but isolated suite of apartments in the Topkapi Palace, where they would live out their lives in luxury but in complete isolation from the outside world. This was more humane than fratricide. It was also a disaster for Ottoman governance, because when a sultan died without a direct heir, which happened regularly, the next sultan was drawn from the kafez. A man who had spent decades in isolation, with no political experience, no military experience, no understanding of how the empire functioned, no relationships with the key power brokers of the state, and frequently severe psychological damage from years of confinement, suddenly found himself in charge of the most powerful empire in the world. The results were predictably catastrophic. Ibrahim I, who became sultan in 1640 after spending 22 years in the kafez, is known to history as Ibrahim the Mad. He was eventually deposed and strangled by his own officials. He was not the only kafez-produced sultan whose reign was a disaster, but he was the most spectacular example. The empire was beginning to consume itself. The phrase "sick man of Europe" was coined by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia in 1853 to describe the Ottoman Empire, and it captured something real about the empire's condition in the 19th century. But the sickness had been developing for 200 years by that point, and understanding the full trajectory of the decline requires going back to its roots. The military defeats began accumulating in the late 17th century. The Second Ottoman Siege of Vienna in 1683 was the turning point. A huge Ottoman army under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha besieged Vienna for 2 months before a relief force of Polish and German troops under the Polish king Jan III Sobieski broke the siege in a single battle. The Ottoman army was routed. The retreat that followed turned into a comprehensive disaster. The Ottomans lost Hungary, Transylvania, and large parts of the Balkans in the subsequent years of warfare. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 was the first major Ottoman territorial concession in European history. For an empire that had done nothing but expand for nearly 4 centuries, giving up territory was psychologically as well as strategically catastrophic. And it kept happening. Russia, under Peter the Great and his successors, began systematically pushing the Ottoman frontier south toward the Black Sea. Austria kept pushing from the northwest. Venice, Persia, local rebellions, the pressure was coming from every direction simultaneously. Each military defeat exposed the gap between Ottoman military capacity and that of its opponents, a gap that was growing because European armies were modernizing and Ottoman armies were not. The fundamental problem was the Janissaries. Every sultan who understood that military reform was essential ran into the same wall. The Janissaries would not allow changes that threatened their privileges. When Sultan Selim III attempted a series of military reforms in the late 18th century, creating a new European-style infantry corps alongside the traditional Janissary structure, the Janissaries revolted and had him deposed and killed. When his successor, Mustafa IV, tried to compromise, the reformers deposed him too. The Ottoman Empire was trapped. It needed military reform to survive, and the military would not allow reform. The solution, when it finally came, was brutal. Sultan Mahmud II, one of the most capable Ottoman rulers of the 19th century, spent years carefully preparing the ground. He built up a new military corps loyal to him personally. He cultivated alliances with the religious establishment. He waited until he had sufficient force and sufficient political cover, and then in June 1826, he destroyed the Janissaries. When they revolted against his reforms, as they had revolted against every reforming sultan before him, Mahmud had their barracks surrounded and set on fire. Those who escaped were hunted down. The Janissary Corps, which had existed for nearly 5 centuries, which had been the military backbone of the Ottoman Empire at its greatest, which had taken Constantinople and besieged Vienna and dominated the Mediterranean, was abolished in a single day. The event is known in Ottoman history as the Auspicious Incident. Mahmud II then proceeded with his reforms. He created a new European-style army. He established new schools. He reformed the administrative system. He was genuinely trying to save the empire by transforming it. And he was largely too late. The territorial losses had already accumulated to a devastating degree. Greece had won its independence in 1829, supported by Britain, France, and Russia, the first of the Balkan nations to break free from Ottoman control, and not the last. Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Montenegro. One by one, the Balkan territories were lost over the course of the 19th century, each loss accompanied by atrocities on both sides that poisoned the relationships between communities that had coexisted for centuries. The empire was retreating, slowly but inexorably, from the territories it had held for 400 years, and the great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Austria, Russia, were circling, each one with its own interest in what would happen when the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed completely. This maneuvering became known as the Eastern Question, and it dominated European diplomacy for a century. What nobody fully appreciated was that the answer to the Eastern Question was going to come in the form of a world war. The Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary in November 1914, and it was one of the most consequential decisions in the empire's history, and not in a good way. The decision was not inevitable. There were serious figures in the Ottoman government who argued for neutrality, who understood that the empire was too weak and too fragmented to survive another major war. But the faction that won was led by a group of young military officers known as the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, who had seized power in a coup in 1908 and believed that alliance with Germany offered the best chance of reversing the territorial losses of the previous century. They were catastrophically wrong. The Ottoman military in 1914 was not the force it had been even 50 years earlier. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, a series of conflicts in which the Balkan states allied to push the Ottomans almost entirely out of Europe, had been a disaster. The Ottoman army had lost 90% of its European territory and a significant proportion of its best soldiers in 2 years. It was exhausted, undersupplied, and demoralized. Sending it into a world war against Britain, France, and Russia simultaneously was asking the impossible. The campaigns of the First World War were a catalogue of catastrophe. At Gallipoli in 1915, an Allied attempt to force the Dardanelles and knock the Ottomans out of the war was defeated, but at enormous cost to both sides. The Ottomans held at Gallipoli. It remains one of the most celebrated military victories in Turkish national memory, but the victory was Pyrrhic. In the Caucasus, the Ottoman campaign against Russia ended in one of the worst military disasters in the empire's history, with entire armies destroyed by cold and disease as much as by enemy action. In Mesopotamia, British forces eventually captured Baghdad in 1917. In Palestine, British forces under General Allenby advanced steadily northward, supported by the Arab Revolt, the uprising of Arab tribes who had been promised independence in exchange for fighting against the Ottomans. The empire was being dismembered from every direction simultaneously. In the middle of all this military disaster came one of the darkest chapters in Ottoman history. In 1915, the Young Turk government ordered the deportation of the Armenian population of Anatolia, a Christian minority that had lived in the region for millennia. The deportations were carried out with extreme violence. Armenians were marched into the Syrian desert with no provision for food or water. Massacres were carried out by Ottoman soldiers and irregular forces. Estimates of the death toll range from several 100,000 to over 1 million people. The question of whether this constitutes genocide has been a matter of intense political controversy, but historians of the period are largely in agreement that what happened to the Armenian population in 1915 was a systematic campaign of destruction. It remains one of the defining tragedies of the early 20th century and one of the deepest wounds in the historical memory of the Armenian people. The war ended for the Ottomans in October 1918 with the Armistice of Mudros. The empire had lost. What remained of its territory was occupied by Allied forces. British and French officials were already carving up the Middle East according to their own interests. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 had secretly divided the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire between Britain and France, drawing borders that bore no relationship to the actual geography of communities on the ground, and that created the conditions for conflicts that are still unresolved today. The Sultan in Istanbul was essentially a prisoner in his own capital, his authority reduced to a formality. The fate of his empire decided in Allied conferences. The 600-year empire appeared to be over, and then something unexpected happened. A military officer who had commanded at Gallipoli, who had fought on multiple fronts during the war, who had survived the catastrophe and watched his country being divided by foreign powers, decided that it was not over at all. Mustafa Kemal was, by the time the First World War ended, arguably the most capable military commander the Ottoman Empire had produced in 2 centuries. His successful defense at Gallipoli had made him a national hero at a moment when the empire desperately needed heroes. He was also deeply, almost contemptibly dismissive of the Sultan and the old Ottoman establishment. He had watched them lead the empire into a catastrophic war and then accept humiliating peace terms, and he had no intention of accepting those terms on behalf of the Turkish people. When the Allied powers began implementing their post-war plans for the partition of Anatolia, awarding chunks of it to Greece, Armenia, France, and Italy, Mustafa Kemal organized resistance. He went to Anatolia, established a rival nationalist government in Ankara, and began building a new army from the remnants of the defeated Ottoman military. What followed was the Turkish War of Independence, fought between 1919 and 1923, in which the Turkish nationalist forces defeated Greek, French, Armenian, and irregular forces successively, reversed the territorial settlements of the Paris Peace Conference, and established Turkish control over the Anatolian heartland. It was one of the most remarkable military and political comebacks in modern history. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne recognized the new Turkish state and its borders, and simultaneously, Mustafa Kemal, who would take the surname Ataturk, father of the Turks, abolished the Sultanate. The Ottoman Empire, which had existed since 1299, which had outlasted the Byzantine Empire it replaced, and the European empires that had tried to contain it, which had produced some of the greatest rulers and the most terrible disasters in the history of the medieval and early modern world, was over. The last sultan, Mehmed VI, left Istanbul on a British warship on November 17, 1922. He never returned. He died in exile in San Remo, Italy in 1926. The Caliphate, the Ottoman claim to spiritual leadership of the Sunni Muslim world, which had been one of the pillars of imperial ideology, was abolished in 1924. What Ataturk built on the ruins of the Ottoman Empire was something entirely different, and deliberately so. The Republic of Turkey, proclaimed on October 29, 1923, was a secular nationalist state modeled on European republican principles. Ataturk was a modernizer of extraordinary determination and considerable ruthlessness. He replaced the Arabic script with the Latin alphabet. He replaced Islamic law with a secular legal code based on Swiss civil law. He abolished the fez, the traditional Ottoman headwear, and mandated Western dress. He gave women the right to vote in 1934, before France or Italy had done the same. He moved the capital from Istanbul to Ankara. He renamed Constantinople Istanbul officially. He dismantled the entire institutional structure of the Ottoman state and replaced it with something new. Whether all of these changes were necessary, whether they were too rapid, or the manner in which they were imposed was too authoritarian, these are questions that Turks are still debating today. What is not in question is the scale of the transformation. Within a decade of the Ottoman Empire's collapse, the successor state had been remade from top to bottom. And beyond Turkey, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire left consequences that shaped the entire 20th century. The borders drawn by Britain and France in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, created artificial states that contained incompatible communities and set up conflicts that have never been fully resolved. The promise of Arab independence that was made to secure the Arab revolt and then broken in the Sykes-Picot Agreement created a legacy of betrayal that still shapes Arab attitudes toward the West. The territory of Palestine, promised by the British simultaneously to Jewish settlers and Arab inhabitants in contradictory statements, became the ground for one of the longest-running conflicts in modern history. The sick man of Europe died in 1922, but the illness he left behind has never been entirely cured. The Ottoman Empire lasted 623 years. This is a number that is almost impossible to process in human terms. 623 years ago from today, the 100 Years' War between England and France was still being fought. The Black Death was a recent memory. Constantinople was still a Christian city. The Americas were unknown to Europeans. The printing press had not been invented. Everything that we consider the modern world, nation-states, democracy, industrial economies, global trade, and mass communication, did not exist. The Ottoman Empire was founded before all of that and outlasted most of it. Its territory at various points included all or parts of what are now 32 separate countries: Turkey, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, Croatia, Hungary, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Yemen, and Sudan. To put that in perspective, the current European Union has 27 member states. The Ottoman Empire at its peak contained more territory than that, governed as a single political entity for centuries. The administrative challenge of running such an empire was enormous, and the Ottomans met it with a system that was genuinely innovative for its time. The millet system, which allowed different religious communities to govern their own internal affairs, was not perfect, and it was not equality, but it was a form of managed diversity that kept fundamentally incompatible communities living alongside each other in relative peace for centuries. The cities of the Ottoman Empire were, at their best, genuinely cosmopolitan in ways that most European cities of the same era were not. Istanbul in the 16th century had significant Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and Turkish communities all living and working in the same city. The Grand Bazaar was a genuinely multi-ethnic commercial space. The palace schools trained administrators from Christian and Muslim backgrounds simultaneously. The architectural legacy of the Ottoman Empire is extraordinary and largely underappreciated. Mimar Sinan alone designed over 300 structures across the empire: mosques, hospitals, bridges, schools, caravanserais, in a body of work that represents one of the great architectural achievements of the 16th century. The Suleymaniye Mosque, the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, the mosques of Istanbul that define the city's skyline, these are buildings of genuine genius that stand comparison with the greatest architecture of any civilization. The culinary legacy is everywhere, and nobody talks about it. Coffee, which now sustains the entire modern workforce, spread to Europe through the Ottoman Empire. The first coffee house in Vienna opened in 1683, established by a Polish entrepreneur using coffee beans captured from the retreating Ottoman army. Turkish coffee, baklava, kebab, yogurt, börek, enormous swaths of what is now considered Mediterranean or Middle Eastern cuisine was developed in Ottoman kitchens and spread across the empire's vast territory. The political legacy is the most complicated and the most contested. The borders of the modern Middle East, drawn by Britain and France on the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, have generated conflicts that have killed millions of people and show no sign of resolution. The promise and betrayal of Arab independence created a template for Western relationships with the Arab world that has repeated itself in various forms ever since. The question of what would have happened if the Ottoman Empire had been allowed to reform rather than being carved up by its enemies is one of history's great unanswerable hypotheticals. Ataturk's Turkish Republic survived and eventually thrived. Turkey today is a significant regional power, a member of NATO, and one of the most important states in the Eastern Mediterranean. The other successor states have had more complicated trajectories. But the Ottoman Empire itself, the 600-year project that began with Osman's tiny emirate in northwestern Anatolia, left marks on the world that have not faded and will not fade for a very long time. There is one place where the entire Ottoman story is physically present, where you can walk through the layers of the empire's history and feel the weight of 600 years in the stones under your feet. That place is Istanbul. The city that was Byzantium before it was Constantinople, before it was Istanbul, sits on its peninsula above the Bosporus exactly as it always has. The geography unchanged, the waterway between Europe and Asia as strategically important as it was when Constantine chose this site 17 centuries ago. Walk through Istanbul today and you walk through empires. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century to protect the Byzantine capital, still stand in sections along the western edge of the old city, crumbling in places, patched and rebuilt in others, but still recognizably the fortification that held for 1,000 years and finally fell on May 29, 1453. The Hagia Sophia, which Justinian built in the 6th century as the greatest church in Christendom, which Mehmed II converted to a mosque in 1453, which Ataturk made a museum in 1934, which was reconverted to a mosque by the Turkish government in 2020, still stands at the heart of the old city. Its dome still floats above the city's skyline. Its interior still catches the light through the ring of windows exactly as Justinian's architects intended. The Topkapi Palace, from which Ottoman sultans governed their empire for nearly 4 centuries, is now a museum that receives millions of visitors a year. You can walk through the throne room where Suleiman received ambassadors. You can see the harem apartments where the Valide Sultan held court. You can stand in the treasury and look at the jewels that were accumulated over centuries of imperial wealth. The Grand Bazaar, established in the 15th century by Mehmed II, is still operating, still a maze of covered streets and specialized markets, still selling carpets and spices and gold and everything else the Mediterranean world has to offer, continuously in business for over 500 years. The Blue Mosque, built by Sultan Ahmed I in the early 17th century, directly opposite the Hagia Sophia, its 6 minarets causing a diplomatic incident when they matched the number of minarets in Mecca, still calls the faithful to prayer 5 times a day. The Suleymaniye Mosque, Sinan's masterpiece, still dominates its hilltop above the Golden Horn. The Galata Tower, built by the Genoese in the 14th century, still looks out over the city from its hilltop on the northern shore of the Golden Horn. Byzantine columns and Ottoman fountains and 19th century European-style embassies and 21st century apartment blocks all occupy the same streets. The city is a palimpsest, a document written over and over on the same surface, each layer showing through the ones above it. This is what 600 years of imperial history looks like when it survives. And it is why the Ottoman Empire, for all its complexity and all its darkness and all its failure, the fratricide, the cafes, the Janissary revolts, the Armenian tragedy, the catastrophic decision to enter the First World War, deserves to be understood as one of the great civilizational achievements of human history. It governed enormous diversity with reasonable effectiveness for an extraordinarily long time. It produced art and architecture of genuine genius. It created administrative systems that were innovative and functional. It gave the world coffee and baklava and some of the most beautiful buildings on earth. And it ended not with a whimper, but with a transformation. The successor state that Ataturk built has endured for a century and continues to endure, carrying the Ottoman inheritance in its culture and its cuisine and its architecture and its complicated relationship with its own history. The Ottoman Empire is gone. Istanbul is not. The Bosphorus is not. The Hagia Sophia is not. And the 32 countries that carry its borders and its communities and its unresolved conflicts in their daily lives, they are very much not. The empire ended. Its consequences did not. And that, perhaps, is the most Ottoman thing of all. And that is the story of the Ottoman Empire. 623 years, 3 continents, 32 countries and a legacy that is still being lived out in the politics and borders and conflicts of the world we inhabit today. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, and this was a long one, I genuinely thank you for being here. Drop this in the comments. It is a real line spoken by Mehmed II when he entered Constantinople on May 29, 1453, reportedly standing in the ruins of the Great Byzantine Palace. What a city we have given over to plunder and destruction. He said it not in triumph, he said it in something closer to grief. A conqueror mourning what he had just conquered. Leave that in the comments. If you know, you know. Subscribe and hit the bell. There's a lot more history coming and you do not want to miss it. I will see you in the next one.